Krasner. I'm the director of the Mercer Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Center, housed at Mercer County Community College in West Windsor, New Jersey. Obviously, we're not there tonight. We are here in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance. For the students among us, Shoah is Hebrew for Holocaust. Our focus tonight is the Voyage of the St. Louis. And so I'm going to turn it over to tonight's moderator, Dr. Alison Dobrik. Tonight's event is jointly sponsored by Mercer County Community College and our Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Center, and William Patterson University, which Alison is representing. And she is associate professor in the College of Education at the university, and also serves as the director of the university's Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center. Welcome, Alison, and welcome everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. And I just want to thank you and really offer you some praise for conceiving and arranging such a wonderful event tonight. And thank you personally for inviting me to participate. I'm very honored in that.
Thank you.
So our speakers tonight are Scott Miller, retired director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and co-author of Refuge, Denied; Hans Fischer, professor emeritus, Rutgers University and St. Louis passenger; and Barbara Krasner, who is the author of 37 Days at Sea, aboard the MS St. Louis, 1939, and director of the MCCC Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Center. And we will hear first from Scott Miller.
Okay, so again, thank you to Barbara and to Alison and to Mercer County Community College, Holocaust, Genocide, Human Rights Center, and to William Patterson College, all the hosts this evening. You do amazing work, and I wish this could be in person and next year. So I'm going to give around, I believe, like 15-minute overview of the story of the St. Louis. And I think many of you may be familiar with it in broad strokes, but the most important thing for you to remember is that in early June of 1939, a ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, and at that point I would say fleeing for their lives, after being denied entry first into Havana, Cuba, were off the coast of Miami Beach. So tantalizingly close to the shores that the passengers could see the palm trees and the sand and the hotels, and the ship was denied entry and sent back to Europe. Now, to give you just a little background of the urgency and the desperation of German Jews at this exact moment when the ship was being sent back in 1939, the St. Louis set sail on May 13th, 1939, only 6 months after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when synagogues and Jewish-owned businesses throughout the Greater Reich, with Germany and Austria, were set ablaze. Jewish money and property was expropriated, and many Jewish men were sent to concentration camps in Germany right after Kristallnacht, to Buchenwald, to Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Oranienburg. So the fact that the St. Louis was sent away from American shores, the timing could not have been worse in the context of the 1930s. After Kristallnacht, Jews were lining up at US consulates to get really two pieces of paper: a visa to get into the United States, but also a waiting number to get into the United States. There were very strict immigration quotas that were put into effect and that were racially based in 1924 in the United States. The United States was only accepting around 35,000 immigrants from Germany per year. So it was not likely that you would go to a consulate and get a visa, but you could get a waiting number to wait your turn till your visa came up. But having said that, of course, you didn't want to wait. If you were Jewish, you didn't want to wait for that visa to come up if you were a Jew in Germany. So at that point, Jews were trying really to go anywhere in the world that would accept them, was with the idea that it was better to wait there with your waiting number than to wait in Germany. Other countries were Western Europe, countries as far away as Australia, South America. So for those who booked passage on the St. Louis, they were considered really the lucky ones because they would wait for their waiting number to come up in Havana, only an hour from, or even less, from Florida, from Miami. And in those days, actually, it was easier to travel between Miami and Cuba than it is today. So again, they were considered the lucky ones. And a great irony here is I mentioned earlier that right after Kristallnacht, Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. There were about 100 St. Louis passengers, men, who were in concentration camps after Kristallnacht, and they were released from the camps because somebody in their family, and in most cases literally came to the camp and showed that they had a ticket to leave Germany. So what an irony that they were released from the camps if they could show that they were leaving the country. So I do have some photo images that I'd like to show, and Barbara has graciously agreed to share her screen. And all these photos are from the archives of the Holocaust Museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and most of them were donated actually by St. Louis passengers. So we could.
So I am trying to get to the file. Here we go.
Thank you.
And I'll put this in slideshow mode. Eventually it will.
That's okay. I can start. Yeah, it's fine. I can continue. Thank you, Barbara. So as I said, the St. Louis set sail May 13th, 1939. And the passengers had, again, in their hands a waiting number to get into the United States and a visa. There were 22 passengers on board the St. Louis who actually purchased, I believe, $500 a visa. Were actually able to purchase Cuban visas, which will play into the story in a prominent way in a couple of minutes. But the rest of the St. Louis passengers were able to obtain from Cuban consulates in Germany transit permits, landing permits, to let them stay in Cuba until their waiting numbers came up. Leaving Germany for most of the passengers was bittersweet. It was somewhat bitter because Germany was the home for many of the St. Louis passengers for many, many generations. But it was, of course, very sweet because they were leaving, they were Jews leaving Nazi Germany and sailing very close to their desired destination, which was the United States. And I will just add here that the captain of the St. Louis, Captain Schroeder, did his utmost to ensure the comfort of the passengers, instructing his crew, many of whom were members of the Nazi Party, that these, the people who paid for these, who paid to be on the ticket for the St. Louis were to be treated like any other Germans, which was an astounding thing to say in 1959 about a group of Jews. And as I said, Captain Schroeder did his utmost to ensure the comfort and well-being of the passengers. And once the passengers were on board, they were able to enjoy, the St. Louis was a ship at the Hamburg America line. Barbara, if you could forward. There were a lot of kids on board the St. Louis. Kids had the time of their life. Remember, they were, prior to this, they were not allowed to play in playgrounds and public parks. In Germany, they were segregated in schools. And here they were running amok on the ship. The little boy all the way on the left, or second from the left, excuse me, his name is Herb. And Herb always said that when he saw Miami Beach, it looked so beautiful that if he was ever allowed back, that he'd want to live there. And Herb survived, and he still lives there today in Miami Beach. Not all the children in this picture have such a happy ending. And the next photo, please. For the adults on board, there were parties, and next photo, thank you. And for young adults and teenagers, there was all types of sports, roller skating, and there was a pool on board. I don't want to give you the impression, though, that there was no tension on board the St. Louis. First of all, there was on May 23rd, there was an elderly passenger named Professor Weiler, Moritz Weiler, who died of a heart attack. He was buried at sea. The captain decided he should be buried at sea because there was fear if there was a corpse on board, that would jeopardize the chances of the St. Louis to land in Havana. And usually passengers Germans were buried in the Nazi flag, and the family prevailed on Captain Schroeder that Professor Weiler, who was buried at sea, would not be buried in a Nazi flag, but rather in the insignia of the Hamburg America line and in a talit. And also on May 23rd, Captain Schroeder received a very disturbing telegram from the Hamburg America line that there was a very good chance that the Cuban landing permits that the passengers had would be invalidated, a decree that was set into motion by President Federico Bru of Cuba, but the Hamburg America line advised that the St. Louis should just continue its course and see what happens, and arrive at Havana on schedule. So the Captain Schroeder made a decision not to tell the passengers. He told just a few passengers who were part of a passenger committee, but he did not want to alarm the passengers. But Captain Schroeder was, for the first time, was confronted with the very real possibility that the passengers would not be able to land. But this was, as I said, unknown to the passengers. On May 27th, the St. Louis lands. It arrives at the port of Havana. As you could imagine, there was great excitement among the passengers and seeing Havana and the palm trees, but yet they were greeted by Cuban policemen who at first told them they would not be able to land right away, but they assured them that mañana they would be able to land tomorrow. But as one of the St. Louis passengers told me, mañana never came. And in effect, the passengers were told that they could not disembark in Havana. And if we can go to the next slide, many of the St. Louis passengers had relatives in Cuba, in Havana, who had flown down from the United States to greet them, or so they thought they'd be greeting them on dry land in Havana. And in fact, among the many people who were there was the father of Billy Joel, as in Billy Joel. Billy Joel's father was a refugee from Nazi Germany, and Billy Joel's father's aunt and uncle, Billy Joel's great aunt and uncle, were on the St. Louis, Leopold and Johanna Joel. And they did not survive, and they were deported to Auschwitz. That's just a sort of a famous family story, but there were dozens of relatives of St. Louis passengers who were in Havana waiting for them. And the passengers rented these little boats to sail out to the St. Louis when they were told that the passengers could not disembark. And you can see them here looking up at the St. Louis, at their relatives, many of whom they would see for the very last time. And if we can go to the next slide, that's actually the mirror image of what you just saw of the passengers looking out at their relatives on these little boats. On May 28th, a representative of the JDC, of the Joint Distribution Committee of the JDC, flew down to Havana to try to negotiate with President Bru for the safe disembarkation of the passengers. And President Bru demanded a payment of $453,000 from the Joint Distribution Committee, $500 a head. And the Lawrence Berenson, who was the JDC representative, made a counter offer. And and they negotiated back and forth. And on June 2nd, President Bru broke off the negotiations. Now, $453,000 today might not sound like a lot of money for a large international organization, but at that time, you have to remember how much money that was, and that the JDC was busy trying to support and rescue Jewish communities around the world. So it's something to keep in mind, and I'm going to get back to the JDC in a few minutes. There was a little drama, though, as the negotiations were taking place on May 30th. A passenger named Hans Lowe
Max Lowe.
Max Lowe split his wrist and jumped ship and to try to commit suicide. And he was rescued actually by Cuban sailors and put in a hospital in Havana. He had a wife and 2 children on the St. Louis, and they were not allowed to disembark and visit him in the hospital. And you should know that Max was already on the St. Louis limping because he had been beaten up a few months earlier at Buchenwald. And also he was limping because he sustained an injury fighting for his homeland in World War I, his homeland being Germany. And he was not going to go back to Germany. So he actually attempted suicide. When the negotiations broke off on June 2nd, the Captain Schroeder made the decision to sail to the United States, believing that there was a good chance that America would let in the passengers. One, because it was America, the country of immigrants, and the Statue of Liberty, but also based on the technicality that most of the passengers had a waiting number to get into the United States. So it was just a matter of letting them in a little early. This is a very important point. The St. Louis passengers were not even what today we would call boat people. They were people on a boat, but they were actually not technically boat people. They were people with paperwork to get into the United States. And the St. Louis passengers cabled the White House and President Roosevelt. And as far as we know, there was no response. They also cabled the State Department. And on June 4th, the passengers received a cable from Mr. A.M. Warren of the State Department's Visa Division. And this telegram really formally closed the door on the St. Louis. The telegram said as follows: the German refugees must await their turn for their formal waiting numbers to come up before they may be admissible to the United States. And with that, the story of the St. Louis, you could say, ends or actually begins, because now was the real perilous journey, where to go. And Captain Schroeder assured the passengers, you can imagine there was mass panic on board the St. Louis, but he assured the passengers that he would not bring them back to Germany. And they began slowly on June 5th, slowly sailing back to Europe. And around halfway through the journey back to Europe, Captain Schroeder received a telegram from the Joint Distribution Committee saying that the JDC, intervened and bargained with 4 Western European countries other than Germany to take in the passengers, those countries being France, Belgium, Holland, and England. And on June 17th, the St. Louis arrived not back at Hamburg, from where it sailed originally, but in Antwerp, Belgium. The passengers disembarked and were dispersed between those 4 countries: England, Belgium, Holland, and France. And at that time, that was considered a happy ending to the story, or a relatively happy ending to the story. But of course, 2020, we know that was not, hindsight's always 2020. We know that was not a happy ending to the story, because 3 out of those 4 countries to where the St. Louis passengers were sent, France, Belgium, and Holland, were invaded by the Nazis in May, June 1940. So to be a Jew in any of those countries in 1940 was the same, for all intents and purposes, as being a Jew in Germany. So the St. Louis passengers, you could say, were double-crossed. They double-crossed the ocean, and figuratively speaking, they were double-crossed. They thought they were going to freedom in Havana, and for many of them, they were yet again under the clutches of the Nazis. So if we can go to the next slide. Here, this is just one example of an extended family. There were many large families on board the St. Louis. You see how happy they look. This is the Dublon family, Ernie and Willie Dublon and their families, believing they were going to freedom in Havana. The entire Dublon family that you see in front of you were deported in 1942 from Belgium to Auschwitz. I'm just giving you one example. And if we could move forward to the last slide. This is a wonderful photo of most of the children on the St. Louis, looking very happy. This is right before they disembarked in Antwerp. And there's a gentleman who's not a child. You can see the mustache and a tie. His name is Moritz Tropper. He was the director of European operations for the Joint Distribution Committee. And he was among the people who arranged for the St. Louis passengers to be dispersed between all the countries. And I end with this photo, really to just so you can focus on the faces of the St. Louis passengers. And I'll end by saying that myself and a colleague at the Holocaust Museum named Sarah Ogilvie, we wanted to know what became of every passenger on board the St. Louis. That was an unsolved mystery that hovered over America for many years. And how we found what we found, it was a decade search. I don't have time to tell you now, but I will tell you something that surprised us and surprised many people, that the majority of St. Louis passengers survived the war. It was always believed, even by those who survived, that they were among the lucky few, and that most of the passengers died, were killed by the Germans. So the question is, how is it that the majority survived? So the reason they survived, and I mentioned this earlier, I said to make note of this, is that most of the passengers actually had waiting numbers to get into the United States. And those waiting numbers began to come up as soon as a month or two after the St. Louis was returned to Europe. They began coming up in late 39, 40, 41, 42, even into 42. And that tipped the scale of survival in favor of this particular group of Jews who were caught up in the Holocaust. But the real unsung hero of the story was also the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, because you might ask, well, how did the passengers know that their waiting number came up? They didn't. It was the Joint Distribution Committee that kept tabs on every passenger. They sent them money every month, and they let them know. They were in touch with the American consuls, and they let the passengers know that their waiting numbers came up. So the Joint Distribution Committee was in part responsible for the fact that so many survived, as many survived as they did. But the fact that the majority survived does not detract from the tragedy. In fact, it sort of accentuates the tragedy, because they all could have and should have survived, because those who were deported to Auschwitz and Sobibor, around 254 of them, they also had waiting numbers that were coming up. And it was just a matter of letting them in a little early. This could have been a great, great rescue story. And it ended up being one of the great tragedies of American immigration history. I have a lot more to say, but I won't say it now, maybe during the Q&A. And I will hand.
Scott, I just want to point out that in this photo, we have Hans Fischer standing in front of Morris Troper.
You're going to all see that he barely changed.
And Eva, is this baby you? Eva Weiner?
Mm-hmm. She's getting unmuted.
I'm unmuted. Yes,
Yeah,
the baby in my mother's arms is me.
That's what I thought. It looked like you. Okay. So I will stop the share. And we'll continue on. Oh, you're on mute, Alison.
Thank you so much to Scott Miller. And now we will look forward to hearing from Hans Fischer.
I will try and fill in just a couple of points that Scott Miller has not mentioned. I always like to start the story of the St. Louis, and in some respects, the beginning of the real terrible tragedy of the murder of European Jewry, with the event that took place in Germany on October 27th, 1938, when the Germans rounded up Polish Jews living in Germany and pushed them over the border into Poland. And among those Polish Jews was a family by the name of Greenspan, and a daughter of the family sent a postcard to her brother, who was living in Paris, and asking him to please try and send some money to them because they don't have proper clothes. It was already getting cold in October. They weren't allowed to take anything along. This happened in the course of hours, that they were put on a train and taken to the Polish border. And so Herschel Greenspan, the brother living in Paris with his uncle, Herschel was 17 years old when he got his sister's message, went to a sports goods store, bought a pistol, went to the German embassy in Paris, and shot the first German official that he saw, who died, and Hitler used his death as the excuse for what is now called Kristallnacht. I like to tell that part of the story because there is an irony connected with this story as well. Herschel was arrested by French police in October of 1938. France was still an independent country, but nevertheless, they arrested Herschel for having killed the ambassadorial German, and he was tried and he was given a jail sentence, but also of a very short duration. However, just a short time later, in November, on November 1st, September 1st, 1939, World War II broke out, and short time later, the Nazis invaded, as you heard from Mr. Scott Miller, Belgium, Holland, and France. And the minute the Germans entered France, they grabbed Herschel Greenspan out of a French prison and brought him to a prison in Berlin. And the irony, which has always intrigued me, is, if you can believe this, Herschel Greenspan survived World War II because Hitler had planned to make a huge show trial of Herschel and tell the whole world what a so-and-so this Herschel Greenspan was. But because of the way the war was going for Germany, and Hitler was personally involved himself with military events throughout, he never got around to having that show trial. And so he actually survived and died a normal death. Some historians claim only in the 1960s. In any case, getting back to the St. Louis, I will very briefly tell you my experience. My father was one of those who was picked up by the Gestapo. I opened the door on November 10th, the morning after Kristallnacht, and two people who identified themselves as Gestapo agents came to our apartment in Breslau, Germany, which is now Wrocław, Poland. And when my father came to the door, after I opened it, they very politely, they were not in uniform, they were in civilian clothes. They very politely told him that he had to come along with them and he should take a small bag with some underwear and some socks. And they left. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang and an enormous amount of noise outside the door. And when I opened the door to our apartment, this time there were two SS men in their black uniforms with boots, and they pushed the door in my face and came in shouting, "You dirty Jews, where are you hiding your weapons?" And they started to go into closets, bookshelves, throwing everything on the floor, and all the time screaming anti-Semitic words and slogans. They did this for about 15 minutes or so, and then they turned around and left. And first thing that my mother did, I have a sister, my mother, my sister, and I were left. My father had left with the two Gestapo men, and he was taken to the police station in Breslau. And from there, he and many other men were taken to Buchenwald concentration camps. And he was incarcerated in Buchenwald until January 6, 1939. And a lawyer friend of his, whom my mother called when these SS men had left, he went into hiding, and so the Nazis did not catch him and were not able to take him to a camp. And at that time, it was still possible to get a little bit of assistance through the law. And he went to the Gestapo, showing them documents that my father had been a veteran of the German army in World War I. And with that certificate, he was able to get my father out on January 6 with the understanding and proviso that he would leave Germany within 2 weeks. And he left on a liner, also Hamburg America line, the same one that the St. Louis was from. And he had gotten a visa for Panama, and he went to New York. And in New York, he had some friends who all told him, for God's sakes, don't go to Panama. That's the worst climate in the world. And so my father was able to get a visa for Havana, Cuba, and went to Havana from New York. And then, of course, my mother, my sister, and I wanted to go to Havana too, to join him. And we had bad luck because I came down with scarlet fever. And so I was laid up for about 6 weeks or so. And so the earliest that we could leave Germany to go to Havana was on May 13th on the St. Louis. So that was how we ended up on the St. Louis. I won't repeat any of what Mr. Miller told you already about the St. Louis. He mentioned it exactly the way I experienced it too. By the way, I was 11 years old at the time, and I have a complete recollection of all of these things. One other thing that I think I would like to mention is that in addition to the St. Louis going to Florida and hoping that perhaps we would be allowed into the United States by way of Florida, the committee of Jews who tried to get us into the United States also tried to get us into Canada with the same bitter results. The Prime Minister of Canada at the time was a man by the name of Mackenzie King. And he is quoted in history books. I have a copy of a history book where it says that he made the comment that 0 Jews would pollute our Canadian blood. That's the kind of person we were dealing with in Canada. So that didn't help either. Anyway, the St. Louis went back. You heard it landed in Antwerp, Belgium. We were assigned to go to France, my mother, my sister, and I. We were transshipped onto another ship which went to France, and from France it went to England. Those who were assigned to England then continued on after we got off in France. And in France, we ended up in a small town in central France, Laval. My experience was, I thought I was being transported back into the Middle Ages. I don't recall that I ever saw a motor vehicle. Everything was horse-drawn carriages. Remember, this was 1939, the summer of 1939. I don't remember that there were any paved streets. They were all cobblestones. And all transportation was in these carriages. One thing that I like to mention is one day, one of these carriages pulled up in front of the hostel where we had been assigned to stay. And the man who managed the horses got off. I still remember he was wearing white gloves, and he asked for Madame Fischer, for my mother. My mother spoke some French, and he spoke to her and told her that his boss, who was the owner of an estate about 20 minutes outside of Laval, he wanted to invite us to visit with him. He was an elderly man in his 70s, and he wanted to invite us. So my mother made arrangements with him, and he came the following week and picked the 3 of us up. And we came to this beautiful estate, an old castle. And we were ushered into a very beautiful room, given some tea and some cake or cookies. And the elderly gentleman started to tell my mother and us, to the extent that I could understand him, that the local priest had for years told the congregants of his church that Jews had horns on their head. And he had never quite believed that, and he had never met a Jew in his life. And when he heard that there were Jews in Laval, he decided this was his time to find out if that was really true. And the story about the horns is a mistranslation of a word, the Hebrew word karne, which talks about Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the tablets, and it says that his forehead was glistening, was shining, and the word karne can mean shining, or it can mean horns. But of course, in this case, the Hebrew translation was that it was shining. In any case, that was one experience that we had in Laval. My father was able to get us visas a second time to go to Havana. My father was, of course, in Havana, as you heard before. And he got us visas sometime in October or early November of 1939. And the problem at that time was to find a boat that was going to the United States or South America. And we were lucky because there was another group of refugees that needed transportation away from Europe. And those refugees were Spanish refugees because the Spanish Civil War had recently ended. And many of the opponents of Franco, who had won the Civil War in Spain, also ended up in France. And so the French decided to take an old French boat by the name of de Grasse, two words, D-E, and the second word, G-R-A-S-S-E, and they refitted it, and they made it available for these Spanish refugees. And there were just a handful of non-Spaniards who were also lucky to get on that boat, which included my mother, my sister, and myself, and another lady and her daughter, who, again, by sheer serendipity, were the relatives of a man who had met my father in Havana, and they had become close friends, and they had rented an apartment together in Havana for their two families. And so we were able to get on the de Grasse. When we arrived in Cherbourg, where we got onto the de Grasse, there was actually an air raid, and a train was bombed by the Nazis. Remember, the war was ongoing already, but we were so used to air raids already that this didn't particularly disturb us. And the next day we had to stay in a hotel overnight in Cherbourg, and then we got on the Grasse, and the boat first went to England, and we waited for a considerable time, close to a week, until the convoy, we were told, of close to 200 ships assembled, and then under the aegis of two British warships, all these boats went to New York. And we were lucky, not a single one of our boats was sunk by German U-boats, submarines, which was very common at that time, because if you remember, or if you have read, the Americans supplied what was called Lend-Lease to Russia and to England, arms and ammunition. And thus the Germans felt justified in torpedoing American ships, even though America had not yet entered the war at all. But as I said, we were lucky, nothing happened. We arrived in New York. The 5 of us, this lady and her daughter, my mother, my sister, and I were taken to Ellis Island because we didn't have papers to stay in the States. And we had to wait a few days until there was a boat from New York to Havana. And then we were able to get on that boat. And finally, at the end of January of 1940, we arrived in Havana, and we stayed in Havana a little over a year and a month or so. And in February of 1941, we were able to get entrance into the United States. And we came to the United States, and my father was 50 years old and he couldn't find any work. And he was able to get a mortgage to get onto a poultry farm in South Jersey. There was a Jewish organization that provided money for Jews to go on farms. There had been a previous such group that actually ended up in Ohio. I had never heard about that before. And there was some time before. And at that time in 1940, in the 1940s, there were people getting onto farms, Jews getting onto farms in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. And we ended up in a town called Vineland, New Jersey. I went to high school there and got into Rutgers as an undergraduate. And from Rutgers, I ended up going to the University of Illinois and got a PhD there in biochemistry, and ended up getting a job as an assistant professor at Rutgers again when I graduated in 1954, and spent the next 56 years at Rutgers until 2010, when we moved to the Boston area where we have 2 sons. I would like to conclude by mentioning that a few years ago, the State Department invited us, a few of us who had been on the St. Louis, to Washington to apologize for not having been permitted into the United States in 1939. And Mrs. Wiener as well. And I remember one very interesting point. There was a young lady. The audience was primarily State Department employees. And this one young lady specifically asked me, how did you feel when we didn't let you into the United States and now you're back again? How did you feel about our treatment, our mistreatment of you and all that? And I don't know, it just came to me on the spur of the moment. I said, you know, it wasn't people really, or rather it wasn't the country, it wasn't the United States that didn't let us in. It was people who didn't let us in. Roosevelt. I still remember when Roosevelt died, my mother was heartbroken, even though he was not the decent person that she and others believed him to have been. And now we know better. And similarly with, as I mentioned before, with the Canadian government at the time, we were also invited to Canada a long time ago, and we're also supposed to be getting an apology, but that never happened at that time. The reason being that a number of Eskimo leaders showed up and started berating the government. I still remember one of them saying, "You treated us Eskimos just like you talked about the Jews." And so there was no apology, but there was one just a few years ago. President Trudeau invited a few of us. There were very few. I don't know. Eva probably remembers. I think there were only 4 or 6 of us who showed up in Ottawa, and Trudeau apologized to us in a very moving speech, and I really felt he meant it. In any case, that's my experience about the St. Louis. There obviously are many other little nooks and crannies that one could talk about, but I think you have gotten the idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. And finally, we'll hear from Barbara Krasner, who has researched her book, 37 Days at Sea, by working with both Scott and Hans. And I am sorry that I forgot to say earlier to please ask questions in the chat, and we will have a period of time of Q&A after Barbara's talk. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's my book, 37 Days at Sea, aboard the MS St. Louis, 1939. I think I first heard about the St. Louis from my mother, and then decades later, an editor suggested I write about the St. Louis. I read Scott and Sarah's book, Refuge Denied, was fascinated by it. I contacted them. Scott replied, and he shared with me a list of people living in the New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York area. At the time, Hans was living in Highland Park, which was across the Raritan River from where I live, and I interviewed him in his home in February 2010. I then proceeded to set up interviews with Fred Buff, Eva Safir Wiener, who's with us in the program today, Liesl Joseph Loeb, Harry Fuld, Lottie Gottschalk-Freund, and a few others. And I did talk to Herb by phone. I didn't go down to Florida to talk to him. So in their homes, I saw Liesl's artwork. I saw Eva's and Harry's presentation materials. They were going out to schools. Fred Buff was going to schools and synagogues. Scott was integral to all their speaking engagements around the country. I knew I'd be writing a children's book and wanted to know about these people's experience as children on board the St. Louis. And I also wanted to ask them what they wanted children to know, today's children. So that summer of 2010, I drafted a nonfiction narrative for middle grade readers. It was boring the way I wrote it. So the editors wanted me to fictionalize it for dramatic effect, and I did not want to do that at that time. In 2012, I decided to rewrite the narrative in verse in 7 voices for an adult audience. And then over the next few years, I rewrote it again and again and again and again, until I came up with one voice, 12-year-old Ruthie Aarons, for a middle grade in verse, and it's now fictionalized. And so this last step gave me the opportunity to create composite characters, so I could take the results of the interviews and other materials I used to create characters and plot. I spent a few days at the joint, the JDC in Manhattan. I was hunkered down in the basement at a microfilm reader. I'm just scouring reports and minutes of meetings and newspaper articles. I went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. I watched, I think, some 80 videos that mentioned the St. Louis in some way from the USC Visual History Archive of the Shoah Foundation. I was able to access donated collections from passengers like Liesel and from Mars Troper's daughter, Betty. I visited exhibits like the one at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan about the St. Louis. And because I was a German major undergrad, I was able to translate the captain's memoir, a very slim volume about his experiences, and some anonymous narratives that were written in France in July 1939. All I knew about these kids is whether they were male and female and their age. And all of these kids were totally fascinated by Max Lowe's suicide attempt. That was something they all vividly remembered. I attended a talk about the St. Louis that Elie Wiesel gave at the 92nd Street Y in New York. And I remembered a profound statement he made. He said, "Never stand idly by." And that's why in my book, Ruthie Takes Action. It's part of a Jewish value we call tikkun olam, repairing the world. And even at 12, Ruthie decides there is something she can do. She does not have to give in to despair and anguish, which was rampant on the ship after they were forced back into international waters outside of Havana. Ruthie was definitely not going to stand idly by. So all this research came together in the development of the narrative, but I think the most vital details came from sitting with people like Hans and Eva and others. Hans, you had told me a story about the dishwasher flooding your house while you and your family were away on vacation. And you were very calm about it. And then when I couldn't get into Lottie Gottschalk's development in Manchester, New Jersey, because the gates locked at 8 o'clock, and that's when I arrived, there's a whole line of cars honking behind me. I'm freaking out. Lottie, ever so calmly and coolly, saunters over to the gate and lets me in. And I thought, of course she would. Of course she would take this in her stride, because they've all been through worse. And so from these people, I really learned about resilience. And even though it took 11 years for this book to come out, 11 years for this book to be published, I'm grateful, of course, to the survivors who shared their stories with me and to Scott and others at the Holocaust Museum. I'm also grateful to PJ Library and in particular their middle grade group, PJ Our Way, for selecting 37 Days at Sea for their book club. And of course, Carbon, which is the Jewish imprint of Lerner Publishing in Minneapolis, for publishing it. And I'd like to just share with you a few poems from the book, just to whet your appetite. Carbon is offering a 20% discount on the sale of the book. There's a promotional code that is in the flyer that I hope you all had received. So if you order before April 14th, you're able to get that discount. So this is the opening poem. It's Wednesday, May 10th, 1939. Locked in, locked out. Father has shipped most of our belongings to New York. He takes out his key to lock our front door, looks at Mother, and leaves the key in the lock. They sold our 20-room house to the first buyer for pennies. I run my hand along the woodwork, risking a splinter, as I've done so many times before. We have no time left. We must get our train to Hamburg, and then a cab, Father says, to the ship. America, where I can walk on the sidewalk, sit on a park bench, go to a movie, go to regular school. America, where Father won't need a special license plate with a J on it for Jew. America, where there are no laws against Jews. America, where I won't be followed on my way home from anywhere and spit on and shoved. America, just the roll of it on my tongue feels like the waves of the Atlantic. Father and mother will not notice I've carved Ruthie lived here on one of the linden trees in the front yard. I take one last look at the house and walk backward to the street, never taking my eyes off the only place I've ever known as home. I refuse to remove the splinter from my palm. Day 1, Saturday, May 13th, 1939, Hamburg, Germany. Yellow roses. I wave to Auntie from the gangplank until all I can see is a dot on the pier. Mother says, "Do they have to play that song?" It's about leaving one's little town. She keeps waving to her sister. Father takes me by the hand. He says, "We are so lucky to be leaving, my girl. Germany is no place for Jews anymore." "But Auntie and Grandma and Peter are still here," I say. A steward announces flowers for Ruthie Aarons. "Here I am," I say. Father calls him over. The steward's name tag says Kurt Steinfelder. He hands me a bouquet of yellow roses. Father hands him a couple of coins. "Who are they from?" Mother asks. She searches for a card. "For Ruthie. With love always, Grandma," she reads. Suddenly, my thoughts go back to last November, that night of broken glass. I'm back at our house, the one we had to sell, and I see the knife sticking up in Grandma's bed, the overturned piano, eggs smashed against the walls, gas seeping out of her stove. What those vandals did to our beautiful home, I could never feel safe again, no matter how often I looked under the bed. When the night is quiet, I still hear the crunch of boots, the rip of fabric, and the banging, the banging, the banging. "We'll send for her as soon as we can," Father says. The idea of an ocean separating us makes me long for Grandma's velvety skin. I want to roll up in her apron pocket like a crescent of dough. I wish I had brought a photo. My tears spill onto soft petals. One single bud begins to open. It must be a sign. The smokestacks belch goodbye. Adventure across the Atlantic Ocean beckons. And then a poem from the middle. If we all held hands. So this is day 27. If all 900 of us held hands, could we stretch across the Atlantic? Could we say we're returning to Germany, but stay on the ship instead? Could we find an island and feast on mangoes and bananas? If all 900 of us held hands, could we have a voice that someone hears? I'm going to skip that one. Day 37, Antwerp, Germany. We have landed. Suitcases piling, passengers filing, eager eyes staring, megaphones blaring, pinstripe suits awaiting, Belgian police anticipating, Morris Troper and the captain still negotiating, 4 groups dividing, to Holland they're train riding, to France and England ship gliding, here in Belgium staying, residing, faces finally smiling. So that's just a very brief sample of the poetry. Thanks, Alison, for putting the link in the chat.
Sure.
So if you're an educator, this is a book you might want to look into. There really isn't that much written for kids about the St. Louis, and definitely not middle grade. And it is based on more than one narrative. So most people just talk to Herb, most authors, that I didn't stop there. So I'll turn it back over to Alison.
Thank you so much for sharing from your book. I'm really glad that you shared some excerpts like that. They're really beautiful.
Thank you.
And it's, you know, I won't sit here talking for too long, but as someone who's been in education for decades, I think this is just such a wonderful book that, you know, will bring it to life for kids, because it has to be developmentally appropriate, the way that you teach about events like this to young children. And this is just perfect. I can see a lot being done in the classroom with it. And just thank you. What a great contribution to Holocaust education.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, there were many questions asked in the chat. Would you like me to just read them and I'll start from there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Let's go back because some of these are questions and some are not. Hold on. Okay. Well, maybe a lot of these are more like comments. So I would say put because there's so many different comments and stuff, if people have questions, I would put them in now so that we can see them. And may I start with a
Yeah, sure.
question? And thank you. This is really a question for all of you. And the question is what lessons we should know and learn about the voyage of this ship.
I'm happy to start, or not, so happy for someone else. I think there are many lessons, both universal and also particular to the Jews and the Jewish experience. On a universal level, I would say the lesson is that there are consequences to a less than generous refugee policy in time of crisis. There are individual consequences, be it the worst possible case, which was the Holocaust, or today when immigrant refugees are fleeing for their lives and not being allowed into countries, including sometimes the United States. And there is individual consequences. It's a human story. It's not just a political story when refugees are turned away. And again, I'm not comparing anything to the Holocaust. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just speaking in universal terms. Also, never be a bystander. I believe Barbara quoted from Elie Wiesel about not standing idly by, and other lesson. And in terms of the, Jewish people, that the Jewish people should never again be homeless like they were in the 1930s. I have the great privilege of traveling to Israel a few times a year. I had it before the pandemic and looking forward to having it again very soon. And I think of the St. Louis passengers whenever I land at Ben Gurion Airport and think if this was only here in 1939 and how important it is to have just one country in the world where the port of entry is controlled by Jews, where no immigration official can say there are too many Jews in this country, which happens all around the world, including in the United States. So that's a particular lesson for Jews in the post-Holocaust era to never be homeless again. So those are my takeaways.
Thank you.
And I think I sort of already gave mine about repairing the world and Tikkun Olam, and Elie Wiesel made that so clear. He was no expert on the St. Louis, but he certainly is an expert on bystanders. And it's always incomprehensible to think that the world stood by and watched. And as I teach a course at the College of New Jersey on America and the Holocaust, we actually use, Hans had written an article years ago that told his whole story. It was a scientific article, but it had his whole St. Louis story in there. So we read it and discuss it. It is important from my perspective that we hear directly from people who had been involved, to hear those stories. I have the transcripts of the people I spoke to, which I haven't turned over to the museum yet. That still is something I have to do. And so, to Scott's point, there are lessons to be learned today. And in the chat, I think we saw a note about nothing's really changed in 80 plus years.
Thank you.
I'd like to say something if I may.
Yeah, please.
I use the story of the St. Louis when I speak to children, that this basically was the result of hate and bigotry, anti-Semitism and prejudice. And if allowed, as Scott said, if we are bystanders and allow this to happen in our society today, unfortunately, we may be doomed to live it again. And that would be a great calamity, obviously. My take on this is that one man, Captain Schroeder, was basically our savior. He promised the passengers that he would not bring us back to Germany because he knew the fate. And that when I talk to kids, I say one person can make a difference. So you be that one person to speak up against hate and bigotry and prejudice.
And for those of you who don't know, that was Eva Safir Wiener, who was that child being held by her mother in the last slide that Scott shared.
I've changed a little.
He got
Not at
taller.
all, not at all. So
I
Alison,
haven't grown very much, though. I'm still quite small.
Alison, I was wondering if Dr. Miller knows why Cuba was so benevolent, or we had the illusion that Cuba was going to be the benevolent nation to take in the Jews.
Okay, well, Cuba before the St. Louis and after the St. Louis had a relatively generous refugee policy. There are very small islands. They're not large like the United States, or Hans Fischer talked about Canada. We're talking about Cuba. And what happened, there was a lot of bad luck with the St. Louis. I didn't have time to go into it, but one of the reasons that they were denied entry was because of a corrupt Cuban consular official, Manuel Benitez, in Germany, who was selling these landing permits at a great personal profit. And what a number of scholars believe is that one of the reasons the St. Louis was denied entry was a way of the government saying to Benitez, "We know what you're doing, stop it." And the St. Louis passengers fell prey to this infighting in the Cuban government. But it's not only that. There was a growing xenophobic, anti-immigrant, pro-Nazi movement in Havana. Cuba, like the United States, was still in a depression in 1939. Right before the St. Louis arrived at Havana, there was a very large pro-Nazi anti-immigrant rally. Though Cuba had a relatively generous refugee policy, that generosity was on the decline throughout the war. But there were families like Hans Fischer's family who were able to get to Cuba even after the St. Louis. So I don't know I hope that answers your questions. They were like sort of on both sides of the coin. There was some generosity there, but there was deep xenophobia and also anti-Semitism.
I was just, one other thought though, was Cuba because it was under what, Batista, it was influenced by the US. So was part of the influence of the US was to not take in Jews?
Well, yes, and actually, one of the American consular officials in Havana has documentation from he has letters from the State Department saying that he should not try to this American consular official should not try to intervene on behalf of the St. Louis passengers. Just stay out of it. Yes, so there was the idea of hemispheric security, that the United States really didn't want other countries in this hemisphere taking in passengers as well. So Cuba was influenced to that by a great degree. And fast forwarding to the present, or the communist Cuba, I was in Havana doing research in around 2000. I was at the Cuban National Archives, and there's a file on every ship that came in, and the file for the St. Louis was missing. That's what I was told. And so there's still some mystery there with the St. Louis and why they were not allowed in.
Thank you, thank you.
By the way, if I may, there was hello?
Yeah.
There was if you knew the right people, you could come into the United States. There were a small number of people who were Jewish who were able to get off the St. Louis and were taken directly to the United States. And they were either friends or relatives of Walter Annenberg, who was the publisher of the Philadelphia Inquirer, I believe. And if you had that kind of a connection, you could come into the United States, even from the St. Louis.
There were 22 Jewish passengers who were allowed to disembark in Havana.
Yeah.
And they also purchased, as I think I mentioned, for $500, actual Cuban visas as well. Some of them, though, did stay in, not all of them came directly to the United States. Some stayed in Havana. I actually saw their graves where they're buried at the Jewish cemetery, the Ashkenazic Jewish cemetery in Havana. A number of them went to college and graduate school there and then came to the United States. But you were right, there were 22 Jewish passengers who could disembark. And I'm interested, Hans, maybe we could talk another time, but I've heard about the Walter Annenberg connection, something I'd like to learn more about.
Interesting. This next question is very interesting. It's about intergenerational trauma and how the families, what kind of advice you might have on the healing that must take place regarding similar issues related to family separation and xenophobia and violence today. If anyone would like to speak to that.
I don't think I'm the one to answer that. Only to say that I've worked a lot with Holocaust survivors. I was worked at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for 30 years. And what I've learned is that survivors are not a monolith. So it's hard to, talk about the various ways of that survivors cope. There are so many, just like people, there were, and I even talking to St. Louis passengers, which is just one small focus group of Holocaust survivors, attitudes towards the United States, there are differences. And so for me, it would be hard to answer that one. I'm not a professional, nor am I a survivor who experienced that trauma, but I do know that they are not a monolith. That much I know professionally, but maybe someone else could answer your question.
Well, the only story I can share is one person I interviewed never shared the story with her children. She was willing to share it with me, and she wrote about it constantly in a variety of forms just for herself. And maybe she was trying to lay it down on paper to eventually share with her children, but she just didn't want to share it. She really didn't want to talk to them about it. She was not one of the people on Scott's Speakers Bureau list, going around to schools. So it's kind of amazing that she sat down with me.
Can I say something?
I think so.
Yeah, this is Keith Sachs. I've been sitting here very much fixated on what you're doing and thanking you for it. Very briefly, my wife was a hidden child in Vichy, France, during the war, and afterwards spent 6 years in a children's home in Brenois, France, before coming alone to the United States at the age of 15 and a half, sponsored by, obviously, a relative. They placed her in the 7th grade because she couldn't read, write, or speak English. And it took her 7 years to finish middle school, high school, and get her bachelor's degree with honors. So she was a pretty smart cookie. She had to deal with survivor's guilt for quite a while, and which is not uncommon, and constantly searching for the answer to why did I survive, what made me special, and if it was a decision by a higher order, if God decided I should survive, then what should I do to justify his decision? And, the pain never went away, ever. But she said, I will do what I did best. I will teach. And so she became a very well-known speaker in New Jersey. And she taught the lessons of the Holocaust, which she told the story of the Holocaust. It was not of concentration camps. It was not of death squads. It was the story of the war as seen through the eyes of a 5-year-old child. And the pain and the fear of abandonment, which is very common in hidden children, followed her for the rest of her life. But when she spoke to these children, she spoke to them about their responsibility. They have to be part of the next generation that will teach and work with others to show that there is a better way to solve the world's problems than war, because war never solves anything, and that they have a responsibility to their fellow man and to ensure that no child should ever suffer as those children had suffered in the war. A comment about the Elie Wiesel comment, whom she met in Princeton one time. He had given a speech and she went up afterwards and spoke to him and said, how, after all you endured, can you still believe in God? And she said, he gave me a typical professorial response. How can I not? But one of his other things that he had said that was very, very meaningful to her was that silence is man's greatest sin. The whole world knew and the whole world was silent. And that meant so much to her that it is etched into her memorial stone underneath her picture, along with Tikkun Olam and a quote from The Little Prince. She was an incredible woman, incredible person. And I now give the presentations that she gave.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing
Yeah.
that. That's very powerful and meaningful. Thank you.
Sorry, went on too long. I apologize.
No, don't apologize. It's a wonderful part of the program. And I think maybe the last question, I'm not sure, but it says Stephen, hand raised, but I don't think it's Stephen. So you could unmute and ask your question, please. Person with your hand raised, or maybe you didn't mean to raise your hand. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I am looking for other questions. I'm sorry, there's a lot of comments that are extremely nice, but I know someone had asked, give me 1 second. Someone had asked about the captain and what his eventual fate was. Did he pay a price for his activism and advocacy for Jewish people?
I could start that, and I don't know if Hans's family was in touch with the captain after the war. Captain Schroeder retired. I believe that the St. Louis was his last voyage. I don't believe he was, as far as I know, formally punished. He did write a memoir about the St. Louis, Lost at Sea. Was published, I believe, after the war. And in that book, he talks about how he's in contact with a number of St. Louis passengers. And I know that a number of St. Louis passengers sent him money and supported him. He died in relative obscurity in the late 1950s in Germany, but his reputation was rehabilitated. And I know about probably 15 years ago or so, a group of St. Louis passengers planted a tree for him at Yad Vashem. He was recognized as a rescuer. And so So I don't think he was punished, but I don't think, sadly in his lifetime, I don't think he maybe received the notoriety that he should have beyond the very grateful St. Louis passengers, as far as I know.
He was not a member of the Nazi Party.
Correct, yes.
So when the passengers asked him to cover up the portraits of Hitler on the ship, he did.
Mm.
Hans, you called him a peach, interviewed you.
Wow.
I understand that after the war, some passengers did take up a collection to support him since he was poverty stricken. And I was fortunate enough to be in Israel 3 years ago when we paid honor to him and his name, 6 of us in Jerusalem. And he truly was, a savior, as my mother would call him.
Thank you. This was a question for Barbara about your book. You had said that there have not been that many books about the St. Louis for young readers, and it's such a fascinating story with children in it, and I'm just wondering why.
Well, that is a good question. There was a young adult book that came out, The Other Half of Life, a number of years ago, and the author had talked to Elie Wiesel, and I think she talked to Herb in Florida. And I started to read it, and it just didn't ring true to me. And so, writing any historical work, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, takes a lot of research. And not everyone will do that. So a few years ago, Scholastic put a book out called Refuge, and Alan Gratz had a section about the St. Louis in it, but he barely scratched the surface of it. So I'm hoping that my book can make a dent in it, but there are so many other stories to be told as well. Lots of opportunity to uncover marginalized voices.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for coming. It is 7:30. It was a wonderful, beautiful, meaningful event. And I want to thank the speakers who came and the speakers who showed up to share their life stories and wisdom as well. What an amazing event. You don't see that every day.
So stay tuned for a lunch program on April 20th, where we'll be addressing the discrimination against Asians with open remarks by the Mercy County Community College's president, Dr. Wang, and Dr. Rajender Kaur from William Patterson will be, she's director of the Asian Studies program. Yes. She'll be our guest speaker. April 22nd, we'll be talking about the Armenian genocide with Dr. Paul Bagazian from NYU, and showing a bit of a film clip where he was interviewed. And then in May, the end of May, May 27th, we have 3G New York representatives addressing us. So they'll be sharing their grandparent stories as Holocaust survivors and how that shaped the grandchildren's legacies. And then we have our educators conference coming up in June, the 3rd and the 10th, from 4 to 6 p.m. through Zoom, and that is done in cooperation with Echoes and Reflections. So now that you've attended our sessions, we have your email address. And so we will be sending out notices about these, and we have a Facebook page. Please look us up so you can follow us there as well.
Thank you, Barbara. You're doing a great job.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott and Hans.
Thank you.
Very much. Eva, I thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Alison, thank you so much for stepping in and moderating.
Anytime. Thank you. Have a
So
wonderful
thanks,
night.
everyone.
Everybody.
Appreciations to everyone. Thank you.
Bravo,
Thank you.